Hello, my name is Sarah Jane Estes, and I am presenting my research paper, The Future of Fashion is Sustainable, and showing some environmental and social impacts of fast fashion and the power that we have as consumers to change an unjust and unfair industry. This area is something that means a lot to me. I've spent over 10 years in the fashion design business and working as a sustainable designer. And I've um, worked as a garment worker as well. So these topics are very personal and important to me. Today, we are going to look at what fast fashion actually is, um, looking at some of the environmental impacts, looking at some of the social impacts and the human cost of fast fashion, looking at some alternatives to fast fashion and what sustainable design is, and showing why a just transition out of this model is so important, and showing the power we have as consumers to create change and some of the clues that the fashion industry is moving towards the direction of sustainable. Fast fashion is the leading model of manufacturing clothing. It's when large companies have a large amount of capital and are able to contract sewing labor in the developing world. Some of the main characteristics are low wages for garment labor in those areas, places where very little regulation is put on pollution, and there's very few regulations for safety and health risks. Fast fashion is fast speed, and speed is often valued over quality. There are very high minimums that are required by these factories. It's the only way they're able to profit, and in turn, it creates more waste in the industry. So one of the things I found interesting through my research is that fast fashion is kind of a new manufacturing development, and it's not been around for a long time, and was pushed by a combination of this capitalistic model impaired with our increased demand for cheaper made clothing. And it was in the 1960s that I found young people of that generation valued trendy and cheaper clothing more than the previous generation. And by the 1980s in this country, neoliberalism was the main ideology of our economic system, and capitalism above all other social structures was seen as the best system. In the 1990s, in the 1980s and early 1990s, the popularity of mall fashions began to boom, and brands like American Eagle, Wet Seal, Express were very popular at this time, and they struggled to keep up because they didn't have a global production model. And many of those stores have gone out of business. And in the 1990s to the 2000s, we saw the boom of brands like H&M and Zara that had this global model that were able to produce very quickly. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the volume of textiles Americans send to the landfills as municipal waste is skyrocketing, 11.15 million tons in 2017 compared with 1.7 million tons in 1960. This image I'm showing is of clothing being packaged up and shipped out to countries outside of the United States to be dumped in their water and in their landfills. And this is something that I personally witnessed through working in the fashion industry. Some threats to the environment. I found some stats that 10% of our global greenhouse gas emission come from the fashion industry. And this is more than the shipping and maritime shipping industry. and the aviation industry create combined. And we know now that greenhouse gases emissions are responsible for climate change. This is why this is a very important problem that we have in our society. 8 billion to 150 billion garments a year globally are produced. Approximately 3/5 of all clothing produced ends up in incinerators or landfills within years of being made, just highlighting how quickly we consume fashion. I focus a lot of my research on Bangladesh because it is the country that has the second largest exports of fast fashion and very few regulations on pollution. So these images kind of show you the scenes that go on there around the textile industry. One of the biggest events in manufacturing history was an incident that happened in garment factories in 2013. The Rana Plaza in Bangladesh collapsed, killing 1,134 people. And this was a catalyst for the fashion industry and probably responsible for why you see a lot of changes happening with major brands, and a lot of regulations came out of this. On the day before the collapse took place, structural cracks were discovered and shops and banks in the lower level were evacuated, yet the garment factories above were not shut down because of this prioritizing the speed of getting orders out. And that's when we saw the devastating effects. Another huge problem for workers in the industry are low wages that keep workers in a cycle of poverty and don't allow them to seek the education they need to climb out of that, and keeps them away from their families as well. Organizations in LA, like the garment workers, and the GWC are all working towards a just transition. Just transition refers to the moving away from the current structure of manufacturing without making things worse for the individuals that rely on garment work. And it involves having alternatives in place to reverse the damage of environmental impacts and impacts to the community and the workers themselves. In branding of these large brands, we're starting to see a consciousness towards the environmental impact. Brands like H&M are doing campaigns to show that they are working to put their waste back into their product. And a lot of other large brands are following suit, Levi's, Adidas, and this type of marketing wasn't being done when I was going to fashion school in 2007. So it is a good sign that the industry is paying attention. A lot of them address the waste issue, but aren't addressing the social side. So hopefully that is what is big and next. And some of the smaller brands are starting to take notice, and that's why we're seeing a rise in sustainable fashion brands. And that's at the mission, the center of the mission for a lot of these brands is looking at the whole picture. Brands that I like to advocate for because I've personally worked with them and I know their structure is truly designed to help and solve the problems of the industry. And those are brands like Tonlay out of San Francisco, who source their materials from the waste that's being dumped in the Tonlay River in Cambodia. And then there are brands like Onshal Project that are based out of Louisville, but they work with artisans in India who are trying to work themselves out of the sex trade industry and into a more positive environment through creating fashion. My brand that I created in 2017, Storyteller Studio, I work with local farmers in Kentucky and source my wool and alpaca and hemp very soon. to create my zero waste model. So next I'm going to focus on some things that we can do as consumers and that are within our reach. And firstly, that is vote. It is very important that our voice is heard and that we elect officials who will put policy in place to create change within the industry. And then we're going to go through the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. And lastly, advocating for better fashion choices. First, reduce, evaluating whether you need versus you're impulsively buying something and challenging yourself to buy less, avoiding fads and buying quality made garments that are not engineered to either fall apart or go out of style quickly. And then secondly, I think of t-shirts and how every event you'll ever have in your life comes with a new t-shirt, and really thinking about whether that is necessary or not. Reusing, you can do things like buy secondhand or buy vintage. Consider repairing your clothing that is damaged or that you've grown out of. There's so many people in your community that alter. So this can always be a really great source to use. And how I've personally seen this rise in demand for altering and repairing. A lot of my friends work in the garment industry and they have been swamped recently, which is a good problem to have. It means people are actually taking this resource and minds are starting to shift more broadly. Recycling, sadly, a lot of our places like Goodwill, they end up dumping a lot of the textile waste that they have. And so to keep your clothing out of landfills, consider like more creative ways of recycling your clothing, like hosting a clothing swap, or see if there's artists in your community that could use these textiles. Lastly, advocating for sustainable design and more sustainable practices. An example of like someone with a lot of influence who's been able to make a big impact. I think of the Met Gala that just took place with Billie Eilish working with Oscar de la Renta. She refused to work with the designer unless they changed their policy on fur and completely cut it from their production. And they did this because of her influence. And so always think about like what your influence is and how you can use that to create change. There's so many great organizations working to create change. So when you come across those, like learn how you can get involved or just support them any way you can. Making a statement with big life moments, I think, is a really fun way to advocate for change. Working with a local designer on your wedding gown, for instance, or buying vintage, you can use that as a talking moment for why you made that choice, and hopefully it inspires others to do the same. So in conclusion, I just want to point out that we have, as a society, moved our production system from one thing to another in a very short amount of time. And the signs are out there that the fashion industry is moving in that direction. And we just have to continue to push it that way by changing our own consumer habits in any way we can to create that momentum. Here are some of the sources I use. Thank you so much for listening to presentation, and I hope you feel inspired to try to make those creative changes in your life going forward. Thank you.